Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scribner, and today I'm going to be talking about Stephen King, my reading journey, what I like, what I don't, his writing, a semi-review of Pet Sematary and The Shining, and I am going to be going into like semi-spoilers for them, but I don't think any spoilers that you wouldn't already know, like osmosis of pop culture, and just like there's just things you should know, or like the introduction of Pet Sematary kind of gives away the aspect of the book that I'm going to be talking about. Most people kind of know, so if you want to know absolutely nothing about these very famous movies and books that you probably know something already about, you can click off, but I think you'll be pretty safe. So I grew up not wanting to ever read horror, and then one day it was a bright morning of 2018 and it was January, and I read The Yellow Wallpaper, and I thought this was a great mental health story, and then suddenly it turned horror, and it was only 30 pages, and I was so shocked, but also it was so evocative and it represented mental health in a way that I'd never seen before. So then I tentatively stepped into The Haunting of Hill House, which I thought was just a great exploration of isolation and all of these things in women's lives. And then I was like, okay, maybe I'm ready to read Stephen King. So I read Shawshank Redemption. I'm not gonna talk about it a lot there. I didn't have a lot of thoughts on it, but in January of 2020, right before COVID, I read The Institute. And this was my first Stephen King book. I really enjoyed it. It is definitely more science fiction. I was like reading it, I was like, this isn't really horror. Like, it deals with a lot of like political things, and it deals with like missing children and child abuse and stuff like that. So if you're sensitive to that, it's grotesque, but it's not really horror. And then last fall I read Pet Sematary and I was blown away. It became a book that I absolutely loved. I loved the grief, I loved the exploration of the family dynamics. Everything was just so wonderful. And then I just finished The Shining by Stephen King a few days ago, and again, I think Pet Sematary is my favorite, but Shining was so well done. I think that there is some elements of the stories that cross through all of them. First of all is this kind of like timelessness, and I noticed this first while reading The Institute. It takes place in like this kind of southern town. We have this boy Luke who's 12 years old and he has abilities, so he's running away and he's on a train. It just kind of feels like it's like this mid-century story about this boy running away. And then we also have this man who like, you know, just ended up in a small town, and he goes around and like knocks on people's doors and stuff, and these people's lives collide. And it feels very timeless but also very modern because there's reference, and it came out in like 2018 or so. It was just a very interesting and very good book. I didn't have a huge lot of thoughts about it, and I was like, I'm hooked, I'm just not in love. The Shining has three main characters. We have Danny, who is the son. He is 5 years old and he's very intelligent, and he can see ghosts, and he can think people's thoughts and telepathically communicate with other people who have the Shining. His father is an English teacher who was laid off, and his mother is a very intelligent, very strong woman who came from a family of divorce and is afraid of repeating cycles of dysfunction and blames herself a lot, but is also very strong. I like the fact that, you know, you can have a woman who is strong and quite feminist, especially for 1977, but also you understand why someone like her can be strong and also stay with someone who's abusive. Like, she doesn't ever choose to say that his behavior is okay, but she can still stay with him. And I think that that's a nuance that's sometimes completely gone. And you have that element when he comes home and he's talking about the fact that, you know, she starts talking to him about divorce, and he says, give me 1 week. And there's this element of that which I think is just so well done. This dynamic of this family that's struggling with alcoholism, that's struggling with their own demons, and their son, and how he has to deal with it, and how it's affecting him growing up. And they go to this hotel that has this history of haunting, that has this history of death, and that has the last caregiver who was there killed his wife and family. And it's an element of spookiness, and it's slow, and it's really well done. Then we have Pet Sematary, which is about Louis Creed. He is a doctor at the local university, and he has a wife and 2 children, and one day a cat is ran over, and he puts it in an animal graveyard, and he's basing this relationship off this old man who lives across the road, and they become friends, and his wife is dying. And there's this element of family, there's an element of grief, and what do we do when we have grief? And you know, Louis isn't the greatest character either, and he's kind of hiding the fact that things are starting to unraveling from his family. And I think that they're both really fantastic books that have a lot of comparisons between them. I had recommended The Pet Sematary to my roommate who had listened to it and then just started The Shining. She's like, do you want to listen to it together? So we have a speaker there, and we were listening to it as we went through the day, and we kept on stopping to just be like, oh my goodness, Jack, like, you're such a dreadful person. But like, we didn't hate him. So Jack Torrance is a writer. He is a man who has struggled with alcoholism, and he was a teacher just like Louis Creed was a doctor. There's some helping professions kind of similarities going in between them. And we have him who is really struggling and wanting to be a good man. He has this really close relationship with his son, yet he also was abusive to him and struggles with his anger. And we have kind of this haunting of his father's abuse and all of these things throughout the time. And he's very afraid of messing up again. And there's this evocativeness when I talk about Wendy and when I looked in her eyes, I saw that our marriage had died. It was so poetic, but also tragic, and also how relationships end when like he sees how much he's disappointed his wife. And there's this line of, how do you look with characters like this? So we have Stephen King kind of almost vocally know something when he's talking through Jack Torrance. He talks about the fact that, he writes really despicable characters, but he actually has to have compassion for them, and that sometimes you can have the most interesting characters in the ones that are really flawed. And I think that that is what both Lewis and also what Jack is as a character. They are incredibly flawed characters. Jack definitely more. There's almost this trichotomy of, you see the abuse, you see what's happening, you see the cycles from his own father, and you have compassion for him, and then you also see the thing that you don't really want to engage with him because he's acting badly. He's treating his wife not always the greatest, and he's being abusive to his son. So you don't want to excuse that behavior, but you also want to acknowledge that, he's changing as a man, and also that he was a bad man. And it's just like, there's so many elements of there, and that you go really well into all of these thoughts and the things of struggling with addiction and struggling with alcoholism and struggling with the cycle of abuse. It's like a very intriguing book. To summarize, we have these two protagonists that are both fathers. Their wives are really strong, awesome women who they have somewhat loving and somewhat not loving relationships with. It's complicated. Their wives are definitely way better people than them. They're both in professions of helping as a teacher and as a doctor, and they have let down their students. One has been abusive to his students, and the other has let a student die. And there's that haunting them. It's haunting the way that they see the world and the way that they see themselves and their family. And then we also have their children who have abilities. So Danny can see things. He has the Shining. Danny has the Shining, which is hard to explain. He has some telekinetic abilities. He can talk to ghosts. He can talk to elements. And there's just a lot of things that he can see. He has more awareness of the supernatural. Sometimes he can read people's thoughts a lot. And I thought that was really well done. We really get to see a great job and how that helps him in the world and how that hinders him in the world. And then we have Ellie, who has some Shining abilities as well. And then we have Gage, who things happen to him in Pet Sematary. As I keep on saying, one of the things I love is slow stories, and I think that's why the climax didn't work for me. Neither of these books I found scary, to be honest. Like, I didn't find them at all scary. I just found them very intriguing and well written, which meant when we had the climax happen, it didn't pay off very well for me, because it's much more interesting to watch Jack struggle with alcoholism than to watch what happens in the end. It's much more easy to have Lewis struggle with what he does than what happens. You know what I mean? It's those things where I will talk about spoilers and I will leave a timestamp and talk about them in details. But my general non-spoilery thoughts is that I really enjoyed the build-up. The climax kind of fell short for both of them, and then I really enjoyed the last epilogue part was really good. So it's one of those things where 90% of the book I enjoyed, I didn't really enjoy the climax part, and then I enjoyed the end. So spoilers, I will leave a timestamp, and you can come back, and I will come back and talk about the books that I'm thinking about reading, asking your thoughts on it, and concluding my thoughts on Stephen King so far. My spoilers is, the one moment when I was really terrified is when Dick goes back into the shed. I thought that was the one moment of horror, and it works for me on a horror aspect because we're not looking at, this demon-possessed thing. We're looking at this moment of, he has gone so far, and now he's gonna fail. They've almost gotten out of it. That was the moment of horror. And I think that throughout most of the compelling parts for me was Rachel coming back and Dick coming back. I found those elements of, rushing to save, that anticipatory wanting of knowing something is wrong, but not knowing how to solve it, knowing that you just need to get back to your spouse, you just need to get back to this kid, and maybe you can save their life, but you can't. And in one element, Danny is saved, and the other, Gage is not, and it's so well done. Those were parts of me where I found the most, almost the thriller aspect of it, not the possession. Because Gage as a evil dead baby, not that compelling. Neither is Jack once he becomes fully meshed with his father in the old cage, whatever, and the things. I did think the element of the black, coming out of the top of the hotel, interesting. I thought that was very compelling. But what we have is this element where that point when they're just running with violence and hurting people, that's not that compelling to me. I don't know why. I think that that's the part of, I think once Gage and or Jack becomes like more of an it. I think that they refer to them as it, and I'm very curious to see if it, the book, has comparison to how, you know, he refers to them as it's once they lose their sense of who they were. That part isn't that compelling to me. That element of, because to me, the element is I care about, you know, Gage. I care about the fatherhood and the son relationship, and I care about like Jack and Danny. So once they become completely consumed, that element doesn't work for me. I did find it interesting, and I did find Lewis's one much more struggling because it's his son, obviously. So that more than just Danny running away. But the elements of coming back, I really liked the final scenes in both of them. I really loved, you know, that Lewis believing that he can save his wife, that he can just, if he just gets him soon enough, he can save him. Because that talks about grief so well. The element of, in just enough case, I can do it, I can make it better. And, you know, her coming back and her obviously not being okay, and knowing this cycle is going to return, knowing that he's not going to be okay. And it's like haunting, and I can feel the goosebumps on my back talking about that. That is so well done. And I like that it's a bad ending because it makes sense. There's no way that that story works without it. However, at the Overlook, when you have, you know, Danny and Wendy getting away, and you have the element of Dick coming back, and you have them sitting at, you know, the family motel area or whatever, and you have Danny really struggling with the fact that he loves his father and that he's really hurt that his father is dead, but also the fact that his father tried to kill him. It's really, really emotional, and it works so well. Like, I think that, you know, if Danny had died or Wendy had died and they had just been disappeared, that would have been less effective than the fact of how do we move on from trauma. And I'm interested to read Dr. Sleep or not read Dr. Sleep. I'm not sure if I'm going to pick it up because I think that that is such a great ending, and it's something that anyone who's gone through abuse or gone through things like that will really understand, that you can grieve for a person who hurt you. And that's one of the themes of The Shining that I find really compelling and really emotional. You know, you have these cycles of grief where you can't say goodbye, so you're losing more and more of yourself, you're losing more and more of them, and then you have the cycle of alcoholism and of abuse that just keep on repeating and repeating and repeating. And if you break through, how do you get out of that cycle? I think that those are so strong, and that's why the ending, and I like the fact that, you know, both of them don't end badly or both of them don't end goodly, and I think that that's just so well done. So back to no more spoilers. So for my conclusion, I really like Stephen King as a writer. I think that he's really fantastic. He has a quick, like, phonetic energy in the fast scenes that are short and then short and short, and then he'll have longer scenes, then he'll have short scenes. His writing style is really effective and also really grounded, when also saying elements that, like, you know, when I talk about died in her eyes and stuff like that, there's just these, like, very evocative scenes and writing that are in very grounded words. And I think that even though they're long sometimes and they're short sometimes, I think that anyone can really enjoy this as long as you're okay with the fact that these books have, you know, graphic depictions and like racism and homophobia and lots of other things that are going to bother people. But the elements of the fact that I think it is accessible to anyone of any reading style and can be enjoyed by someone who, like me, tends to like more beautiful prose, or like to read someone who likes very grounded, simplistic things, I think it works really well, although the tangent might get you then. I really liked the slow beginnings, I liked the build-up, I liked the slow kind of timeless things, especially since, you know, the books came out, The Shining and Pet Sematary came out in 1977 and 1983, and they feel really relevant to today, and they also feel like timepieces. So I thought that was just a really well element. Sometimes I forget the fact that The Shining is 45 years old. Like, that's an old book. When I was reviewing The Institute, which was my first book, I did say this book hooked me. It was very interesting. I loved the things, and I think that that's where I'm staying. I don't love these books. They're not going to be favorites. I think they're really, really well done books, and you can tell I praised about these books. I got a little teary-eyed in the spoiler section. I got a little freaked out, and yet they're not books that I'm going to like remember forever, but they are books that I find incredibly intriguing, and I'm very intrigued to read more Stephen King. And I think the older that I become and the more that I read and write, I really become fascinated with how stories are told, and that's what I love about Stephen King. His plots, again, I don't love his climaxes. I don't like the full takeover of evil. Like, that part just isn't compelling to me, but what is compelling is the writing, the way that he does characters, the way that he does that. So that's saying, what am I going to be reading next? So I think the obvious choices would be The Stand and It. These are his two most well-known books. I think there's a nice quartet of Pet Sematary, The Shining, The Stand, and It as kind of his most famous books, maybe add Misery in there. And there's these elements of it, and I do want to read these books. These are both incredibly long books. They are both about 45 to 50 hours. I'm not kidding, on audiobook. And I do think I'm going to be reading on audiobooks. Even though I love Stephen King, I don't think I'm going to buy any of his books because I think reading to horror is just a very good aspect. Like, I like hearing horror. It adds the spookiness of it. So I think I will be listening to all of them on horror. So, but the issue is that they also deal with sexual violence. So if you've read these books, I would love to hear it because I can read sexual violence. I just often find it more triggering than a lot of things, especially if it's not handled well. He has handled a lot of like abuse and stuff like that really well. So I believe that he can do it. I would just love for someone to tell me like how detailed, how graphic it is, how much of it is, because I think it's only contained to the end or something like that, but I know The Stand is very, I think, thorough. Two other books that I definitely want to read, which is Misery. This is a book that even when I was not going to read any Stephen King, I wanted to read this because I love author books, I love writing books, and this is a story about a woman who's the biggest fan kidnapping this character, who I always want to sell Kevin Sting because it's a stand-in for him, but it's not him. It's this person kidnapping him and holding him hostage until he writes a book. There's supposed to be some analogs for cocaine and his usage of cocaine and his obsession with cocaine in order to get things done, and writer's block and stuff like that. And then I do want to read The Outsider because it is very tied to the Institute, and I'm very intrigued to see how that is and to read more modern Stephen King. I might be an old Stephen King fan because I like the two books that I read old very well, and I like the slow pace and the meandering stuff. And then I want to read Salem's Lot. This is his second book. It deals with vampires and people coming back to old towns, and I think I would be really interested. I want to read Mr. Mercedes. This is his kind of detective series, although this seems to also deal with sexual violence, so again, let me know. And I like the fact that it's a series. I like the fact that it's, you know, supernatural investigations. I find that really interesting. And then we have Dr. Sleep, which is the sequel to The Shining, which, based on the ending, I'm not sure if I want a sequel, so I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And I am intrigued to see, and the premise seems interesting. And then we have 11/22/63. This is a man goes back in time to stop JFK's assassination. Daniel Green loves this book so much, and he is the reason why I specifically started reading Stephen King. So this is intriguing. I don't know if I want to read non-horror Stephen King, because again, mostly I'm reading it for the understanding and the arc. And as a Canadian, I feel like JFK is a little bit overshot. Like, there's a lot of stuff that people are like, let's talk about JFK. And I was like, I don't really care that much about JFK. Convince me if you like this book. Of course, I want to read On Writing. This is his writing book. I would love to read it at some time. Tell me what your experience with Stephen King is, what your experience with horror is, what you would recommend, what your thoughts on the books that I've read or the books that I'm thinking about reading, and leave a ghosty or a clown, whichever you prefer, in the comments, and I will see you next time.